6. Brett and Maynard took cover behind a van. They could still make out Nightingale's voice, speaking about the similarities to the Battle of Lexington, but it hardly registered in the confusion. There was no doubt in the agents' minds that the fire was coming from the anti-government crowd at the house, but they could not see the gunman. Amidst the chaos, an army colonel stood out, giving orders to agents not under his command, but they obeyed even so, for such was the man's command presence that one felt one must obey him. Maynard and Brett were among the few who did not receive orders from him. He was a tall, fierce-looking man with the bearing of a combat veteran, and it showed in his orders. He was aggressive. Like his enemy across the flat field, he had no compunction about changing the rules of engagement on the fly if it was to his advantage. "Get those drones firing on these bastards," he yelled into a comm array. There was a moment of hesitation, but then the drone pilots some miles away complied. From high above in the clear blue sky, streaks of fire rained down upon the picturesque little country ranch and the disorganized gang that surrounded it. The amateur soldiers were no match for the weapons of the professionals. They turned and ran wildly away, firing blindly in all directions. The federal agents looked around in a daze, their eyes gravitating towards the tall colonel, who stood atop an APC, surveying the scene as the smoke from the wreckage wafted over them. "Alia iacta est," said Nightingale's voice from the radio. The colonel's name was Preston, and he was only too glad to speak with the two agents, since, as he put it, the federal bureaus would no doubt be investigating him soon enough anyway. "What you people need to understand is that if it's worth fighting, it's worth winning, and if these goddamn loons are going to be put down, we've got to do it forcefully. They're not going to respect us unless we answer them with force." Brett nodded his agreement, but Maynard was more reserved. She knew that the press would not be pleased with this turn of events, though their sympathies generally lay with the government. "I realize that in all this excitement you folks may not have gotten a clear picture of what's going on here," the colonel continued. "I hope I can shed some light on it for you." "That would be helpful," said Maynard evenly. The colonel nodded grimly and walked to the window, where he looked out at the setting sun. "Some years ago, the United States military created a top-secret protocol for removing potential terrorists from society. Began apprehending them through the use of surveillance drones and taking them to correctional facilities." "I'd heard some rumors about that, but why was the military running it, not the civilian agencies?" The colonel smirked. "For jobs like this, the chief felt that we needed... what is the phrase? Rough men ready to do violence on our behalf. No offense to you folks in intelligence," he added quickly, "but there are certain operations that require a stomach no one but a man who has seen combat can have." "Or a woman," Maynard added. "Or, as you say, a woman," the colonel agreed. "But it will be better if I can take you to the facility. I have a bird outside waiting to haul you to Florida." "Why isn't it a secret any more?" asked Brett. "The chief has authorized me to let you in on this," the colonel answered immediately. "It's a great honor. You're the first non-military personnel to find out." What truly was significant about the massive hidden complex that lay in the Florida Everglades was the large number of Russian prisoners it housed. Under intensive interrogation, the government had extracted a number of useful nuggets of information from those who survived. It revealed a massive network of Russian sleeper cells like that in West Virginia, all of which were secretly providing support to insurgents, anti-government cells, and other homegrown terrorists. As Maynard and Brett followed the colonel down the long, dark hallways of the complex, they passed large steel doors behind which could be heard the sounds of powerful machinery and high-pitched whines which might have been grinding gears or cries of pain. It was impossible to say which. Once they saw a corporal going into a small room while carrying a large transparent crate filled with huge spiders. The colonel walked calmly but purposefully ahead of them, continuing to talk about the situation, but never addressing any of the queer things around them. Maynard and Brett felt instinctively that he would not be forthcoming regarding the rooms that were labeled with names like mentally deficient or deviant, nor introduce them to the unusually ebullient, non-uniformed personnel who would occasionally be seen moving through the halls. Overall, we have a pretty clear picture of what's going on here. The Russians are trying to stir things up by having these wackos undermine the country, and they thought nobody would ever bother to think people going on about America first would turn out to be foreign-backed. Why, even most of these poor dumb bastards didn't know they were foreign-backed. Sounds like you've cracked the whole case, said Brett. What do you need us for? The colonel gestured to an empty prison cell they had arrived at. Tie up some loose ends, he explained. The radio guy, Nightingale? He's the one thing that helps fit all this stuff together. I'm sending you, on behalf of the U.S. Security Force Initiative, to raid his home and bring him in for questioning. Maynard said, with a bit of surprise. Surely blowing up his house in Indiana was enough to send him into hiding. You'd think. But I think he sees himself as some kind of martyr. He's holed up at his house further north. Won't taking him out be just the thing to make him a martyr? Colonel shook his head. It's a calculated risk. We've already leaked some scandals on him to the press to discredit him. The public is being turned against him. All we need to do is have a little chat about who put him up to all this. I've got a stealth chopper waiting for you outside. It'll take you to Nightingale's place. He won't know what hit him. The stealth octocopter landed in complete silence in a little grove. It was almost invisible in the dark Florida night. The two agents departed noiselessly, the broad-shouldered one carrying a tranquilizer rifle. They crept through the humid park and moved a little way down the rainy avenues before the shorter agent called a halt and pointed to a large house surrounded by a high security wall. They looked at one another and then nodded. Maynard took a small pistol from her belt and fired it at the top of the big concrete wall. A hook on a thin cable shot out and arced over the wall, and Brett then took the pistol grip from her hand and began his ascent. After he reached the top, he threw the device back down to Maynard, who followed him up. There was only one light on in the house, on the top floor. Brett raised his rifle and peered through the scope at it, but he could not see any evidence of his target. The two agents advanced slowly towards the back door, and when they reached it, Maynard produced a small tube from her pocket and inserted it into the lock. The automatic lockpick had the door silently open in seconds, and the two crept into the house. The host of Thuban AM did not hide his interest in the bizarre. Every wall was covered by newspaper clippings of weird stories, pictures, and paintings of strange and otherworldly creatures and landscapes. And on every piece of furniture were odd amulets, asymmetrical devices, and strange, mystical-looking sculptures. A dream catcher hung over the doorway, and the entire room was bathed in a dim black light. The two agents crept silently up the stairs, taking the whole surreal scene in without a word. They approached the room at the top of the stairs, through which a thin sliver of light could be seen. They moved up to the door and paused. Maynard raised her pistol to cover Brett, and then, after one quick glance, he kicked the door open. Seated at the desk next to the window was the thin, pale figure of Hector Nightingale. He was wearing a velvet bathrobe and had a book propped open on his lap. He looked up from it as the door swung open. "Hello," he said placidly. "Can I help you?" "By order of the United States Central Security Committee, we're placing you under arrest," said Maynard, aiming her pistol at him. "Oh dear," he said, putting the book, The Golden Bough, aside and knitting his fingers pensively. "On what charge?" "Incitement of anti-government activity," responded Maynard in a clipped professional voice. Nightingale gave a wan smile. "I see. Well, I'm awfully sorry to have to put you to any trouble. I didn't mean for these sorts of things to happen. You can see, I'm sure, how I might not have realized that asking questions about shadow people on the radio would lead inexorably to violent rebellion against the state." Neither agent said a word. Brett handcuffed the old man. "But then," Nightingale continued, "I have never seen the state as the problem, only a symptom. It is only one of many bad actors performing its role in a long-rehearsed tragedy." Brett lifted the man to his feet and began to march him to the door. "Perhaps you are right," the old man continued, "in blaming me, none the less. After all, I am known as an oracle of the unknown, and the unknown is frightening, and in times of fear the state tries ever more aggressively to assert control." They walked him down the stairs into the purple-lighted living room. "All the same, two people as obviously intelligent as yourselves must sometimes wonder about it, no? Why do you have all these machines, all these weapons, and all this power, and yet you still cannot quash the spirit of rebellion among the people? You gain more and more power, and yet, as Sir Isaac would say, the reaction is equal and opposite. It is a dialectic that is yet unresolved." They walked him out of the back door and into the warm night. "Ah, but of course you have no choice but to play your role. To do otherwise is to surrender yourselves to the victory of your opponents, and that you cannot do. Conflict is unavoidable." They moved stealthily through the deserted streets to the octocopter. "But don't you ever stop and wonder, when the guns are silent, and you sit alone in the silence of your bases, what must eventually come out of the conflict? For it is always the case, in every battle in history, that neither side fully grasps the result of the struggle."